What is going on, y'all? I am KMBest. I am joined by Lambyseries, who I once again pointed the wrong direction to. I am joined by Lambyseries. We are together 8 cubes, and we are here to do something a little bit different today. Normally, we cover 8 different topics. Today, we're going to cover 8 different decks. We went through, we picked our top 8 decks in the metagame, the decks you have to know, the decks you have to understand how to beat, and the decks you have to understand how to play if you want to be successful. We're going to start with Loki, which we both agree is the best deck in the game. It's sitting at the top of the list for a reason here. But one of the things that's really striking me about the list is just how different it seems to be when you talk to, say, top players about their perception of this list, and then when you go look at the data websites. And I for one, am a little bit confused as to like how I can play this list and come away thinking, all right, well, this is just the best deck in the game. It beats absolutely everything, good matchups into everything. And then you go to like a website like Untapped or SnapFan, and it's like, all right, well, this deck has a 53% win rate. So part of me is starting to wonder if there's like some sort of legitimately high skill floor on the Loki deck. Part of me is starting to wonder if it's a deck building thing. I know that I am fairly confident that there are certain things that you need to do in the Loki deck in order to deck build it properly in order to see success. I don't really exactly know what the difference is between what I'm experiencing at the top end of ladder, what Lamby is experiencing in Conquest, and what the numbers seem to show about this list. Do you have any thoughts on that, Lamby?
Yo, what's up, everyone? Okay, so Loki, funnily enough, I actually really agree with you, and it's really just the top deck in the game right now. And I've actually stopped looking at like data to define why Loki is the best deck in the game, because it's very difficult to define based on data, because generally this deck, from what I've seen, what I've heard, and what I've like played against as well, there are a lot of people that are not playing this deck optimally, because I think this deck is actually one of the, in the last few months, few decks that have actually quite a high skill cap. Not because it's difficult to play the cards in the deck, they're all just like cards, right? But it's difficult to order the cards, difficult to time the cards. The timing of a lot of the cards in the Loki deck is very important. Like, I think one thing that people don't realize is that they don't know what they should be doing in specific matchups, because there are so many options, right? Like Loki on 3, Loki on 4. Don't ever play Loki. Do I play Angela or do I just skip on Angela? You know, stuff like that. There's like a lot of different play lines for a lot of different matchups, and it's not linear. It's not clear cut. It's not like a deck you can just rock up and say like, all right, I'm just gonna play this one game. I'm gonna play it perfectly even if I don't know what my opponent is playing. It's impossible. You can't do that. Like, this deck is like, you get better playing this deck the more you're in tune with Marvel Snap. Like, the more you're in tune with the matchup, the more you're in tune with the meta. So I feel like people that invest time in understanding this game and like understand how matchups work will actually benefit from playing the Loki deck, because it's very, very flexible. But the mass population, most people just are like, they're casual, right? They just play for fun. They don't really think so much about the game. So I feel like a deck like Loki benefits people that really push the limits of like understanding matchup knowledge. And if you're not that kind of person, you might not really understand why you're not winning with the deck, because it just seems like a power of RNG, which is not wrong. It is a power of RNG which you can sort of control.
Yeah, so like a couple of specific things that come up a lot, like people ask me why I'm not doing something on my streams, and that's usually how I notice that I'm doing something different from the majority of people. One of them is like, why are you getting rid of your kitty pride with this Loki, right? And it's like, well, because it's a 1/4, right? Or whatever, right? Like, or another one would be, why are you not like making kitty pride big
Yes.
on turn 2 and then going turn 3 Angela plus kitty? And the answer is usually because doing Loki stuff is just better than that, right? Like, there are a bunch of like little situations where how you would play other decks like this goes on the back burner compared to just doing your Loki thing. And I think figuring out which matchups are the do your Loki thing matchups, figuring out when you can actually aggressively snap and when you need to wait to see what you get from Loki. Because there are some matchups like that, right? Like, if you are playing against a destroy deck and you Loki them,
Yes.
normally that's really good. But if you get the wrong cards out of Loki, you're going to be sitting on a handful of Deathlocks and you're not going to be able to win the game. And so you can't super aggressively snap into that matchup unless you want to get potentially, just coin flipped, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can usually do better than that. There's a bunch of just really interesting priority situations that the deck has as well, where, especially in mirrors, but also against stuff like Destroy, getting your Cosmo down is important, things like that. And then there's the whole Cosmo game plan. Like in the matchups where the Cosmo is good, the Loki is often not very good, which means you need to pivot from your Loki game plan. Basically, as soon as you realize it's a matchup like that, you need to be like, oh, I'm a mid-range deck now. I'm playing a completely different style of deck. And I do feel like those are like the major disconnects people have, because a lot of people are just like, all right, well, I'm just going to play Loki. But like they're like probably 30% of games where Loki is not the thing you want to actually be doing.
Yeah, so I want to add on 2 points to what you just said, which I think is really important. So my win rate of this deck is absurdly high in Conquest. I think it's because I can identify the things that you've said just now, like quite clearly, like the whole Kitty Pride thing, right? Like the thing about this deck in general is it's an extremely contextual deck, like extremely contextual, because like people like to make the big Kitty Pride, for example, but why? That's because they used to play this deck called Shuri Kitty, which goes Kitty Pride, Master Kitty Pride, Shuri Kitty Pride Taskmaster. But like this deck has none of that, right? This deck has no way to scale a Kitty. So you really shouldn't be prioritizing Kitty so highly, for example. And secondly, with regards to like conservativeness, like you said in certain matchups, like this deck is one of the few decks that is like so good at generating like stuff and discounts that you really can afford to be the person just chilling and waiting for your opponent to do things, and then you decide if you can go in. Because like, especially in the mirror, if you go in on a bunch of nonsense, right, they also can generate a bunch of nonsense and you will just die. So like the mirror is one of those times whereby, contrary to my extremely normal aggressive play style, this is one of the matchups in the mirror that I'm actually relatively conservative, because I want to know if they actually can blow me out with a bunch of random nonsense.
Yes. I'm so glad we agree on this, because this is like, this is normally I'm a little more conservative than you. But like, yeah, specifically the mirror, one of the earliest things I realized 2 things about the mirror. The first is, if you snap aggressively on having the good stuff and then they also have the good stuff, you're actually just coin flipping.
Yeah.
And the second one I realized was greed wins the mirror.
Yeah.
Getting more cards in your hand off the Loki is more important than basically anything else, right? I remember, because like, and I learned this through losing the mirror, right? I'd be like, all right, I'm going to Loki on 3 or 4 or whatever. And then my opponent would Loki on 5 and I would just die, because they would Loki for 7 and I Loki'd for 5. And then I'd be dead. And so there are some cases where you still want to early Loki, right? When you have identified that your only actual win con is just high rolling a Loki, that's totally understandable. You can still do that. Just understand that like you're kind of going all in very early on those kind of plays. And I think that's sort of a situation where we talk about like the context, right? Context really matters in this deck, especially in the mirrors. Like if your opponent is doing something very, very strong and your only out is to try to get lucky off of your Loki, what you're doing then is positioning yourself as like, you know, people complain about how Loki mirrors have no skill, right? You're positioning yourself to benefit from that, right? That is your job. And so a lot of how this deck plays out really is about understanding the spot you're in and then using the tools you have to get out of that spot. And it is very, very good at it. But I do think maybe it does require a little more than I thought. I mean, I honestly, when it first came out, the deck didn't require much thought at all. But once the meta warped around it, such that like there are game decks like Cerebro 3 where like playing Loki is just actually bad.
Yeah, you lose.
Right? Yeah. And so now like Loki is no longer just roll face on keyboard, win game. It's now like, oh, you have to really think about what kind of deck you want to be, because there's 3 decks you can be. You can be the unfair Loki deck, you could be the mid-range Angela Kitty Collector deck, or you can be the Quinjet Agent Coulson deck. And you have to pick one of those for the matchup that you're in based on the cards in your hand.
Mm-hmm. And with that, this is the longest topic we've ever spent on in the history of 8 cubes.
We deserved it. It deserves it.
It deserves it.
It's a good one.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Next up, everyone's favorite deck is back, Galactus. Everyone loves playing against it. It's a deck that famously is fun for the people playing it. Oh, and the people who are playing against it. I'm being told that's not true and everyone hates this. Is there any thought to what do you think about this deck actually? Because I get the impression that I think it's actually pretty good, but it's pretty good in the sense that it just has a free winning line, basically 100% of matchups, right? It's not always going to win, but it has a chance to win against basically everything that you could possibly come up with. And I feel like that's not nothing, right? Like you go like, Nebula, Sunspot, Wave, Galactus, and like you're at very least 50-50ing the whole game, right? And that's like a reasonably powerful thing to do.
Yeah, so I want to agree on one thing firstly, that the people that say it's unfun to play against, I completely don't deny, because this is one of those decks that like okay, so I don't deny, but at the same time I enjoy doing it because like as a tournament player, as a competitive player, this kind of decks are very strong for tournaments, because like they just do the thing and there is inevitability. Like legit, there is inevitability, because like if it happens, you just die, and like you can't snap back, you can't scam, you can't bluff, because if they do the thing, Galactus into Alioth, you just die, right? So it's like in the previous video we talked about it. You have to respect the whole Alioth with when they have initiative, and the fact that you have to respect it means you need to retreat a lot, and people don't like retreating. Let's be real here, people don't like retreating.
Yeah.
And like this deck is very good at making people retreat, because there's a lot of things. Certain versions run Hobgoblin, Professor X, even with the Daredevil. Certain versions have like Leader on the final turn, Alioth on the final turn, Galactus, Alioth. Like this whole deck is based around making your opponent not able to do their thing, which obviously people don't like. So honestly, the deck is actually quite strong. Like I would actually consider playing it like in a competitive setting as well. But in terms of fun factor, people definitely don't like playing against this. It stops you from playing your game. But when it comes to winningness, I think this deck has a very, very high potential to be at the top of the meta.
I don't think it's ever going to be the top of the meta. I think it's going to be one of those decks that's like very common, but fundamentally, though the way I conceive of this deck, I don't really know how to put it into words, but I'm going to do my best, right? It's a deck that has so many coin flips in it. There are so many situations where you have two choices and one of them wins the game and one of them loses the game. And that is what this deck excels at setting up, right? Where it's like, all right, I got two choices here. One of them is going to win, one of them is going to lose, and then we just have to figure it out from there. And it does that, it feels like 2 or 3 times per game. It feels like there are multiple times per game where everything is on the line. And I feel like that's an underrated part about playing against this list, is you're constantly under stress.
Yes.
This is a list that constantly puts your opponent in a fight for their life. And there is, like, if you're one of those people who likes doing that to people, I mean, man, like that, there is no deck better at putting the pressure on than this one.
When you just say that, I honestly like I think that's the main reason why I like this deck, because like I feel like a lot of the time I like to put my opponent in positions whereby like if they make the wrong call, they just die. And like when it comes to snapping, these kind of decks snap very well. Like because you're snapping on like a controlled 50-50, right? You're the one playing the card.
Yes.
You know it's a 50-50. So you have all the agency to decide whether it's where you want to win that 51%. So it's like kind of cool, kind of very strong, and it's a bit degenerate, but it's really good.
Next up is High Evolutionary Wave, a deck that the data sites seem to suggest is being underrated by players like us. It's got a very high win rate in Conquest, a very high win rate on Ladder, apparently, according to Untapped. And part of me thinks, I don't understand that, because whenever I play against High Evo Wave as Loki, I feel like the matchup is extremely in my favor. But the numbers seem to suggest, not necessarily that isn't true, but that High Evo Wave gets to just sort of serve the metagame role of like garbage cleaner, where like you just play High Evo Wave and you beat all the people playing anything that tries to beat Loki, like Cerebro or whatever, and it just is good enough into Loki. Like, I don't think it's very good into Loki, but it's good enough that you don't just instantly lose that matchup, and so it gets to be like a very solid, just, I'm queuing this into an open field kind of deck. So it does have that ability.
Yeah, so I wouldn't want to talk too much about this deck, because like I think I've like talked about this like so many times already. But this deck is good in general because it does one thing and does it very well, which is like play stats early game into a wave, into a Hulk or Doom, done. Like it's a winning line. This is how wave decks work. It's a winning way of playing a wave, and it's not wrong. But the thing is, like, I feel like at the highest level, it's difficult to abuse this fact because everybody knows that's what you want to do. So I feel like being able to win with this deck is about, okay, let's say winning at this deck at a general level is just like knowing how to play your cards and like hoping players fall for the wave. At the highest level, it's more of like maximizing avoiding the games where you have the good curve into the wave and hoping they stay, that kind of thing. Because there's not much edge you can really get, like if everybody knows what you're doing. So the deck is fine. Like I wouldn't say it's bad. It's definitely not bad. It's good, but it's not like that good. Right, where it's actually a
Yeah.
hard counter to Loki. It's just an okay deck. But I feel like if you play
Yeah.
it like at a general level, you definitely can like hit infinite with this deck and like do decently well in conquest.
Oh, yeah.
So it's an okay deck. Yeah, nothing much else to say.
It also has a huge advantage of being just really easy to play.
Yes,
Like,
very
if you
easy to play.
are, yeah, extremely like, and like people are gonna clown on me for this, but I've always been of the opinion that if there are two decks that are equally good, play the easy
I do
one.
agree.
Like, unless you're really, really good, you're probably gonna get a lot more mileage out of just playing the easy one. And so if you like, I don't know, you want to like watch a TV show and play some Marvel Snap, this deck is perfect for you.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. This is the
deck
Netflix and chill Marvel Snap deck for sure.
Yes. It is perfect for that. Like, it is such an easy deck to play. You do have to, I like, in as much as any Marvel Snap deck can be easy, because, right, like, you still have to think a lot about, all right, like, my early positioning dictates my late game positioning, things like that. Like, where am I putting these one drops, etc.
Yes.
But when you're just drawing the right cards, you're just going to play the exact game you want to play all the time. And there is a power in consistency. And I think High Evolutionary is a great deck for someone who's just like, you know, all right, I don't really have a good handle on this meta. Loki is very, very in-depth. I don't really necessarily feel like I want to play a bunch of Loki mirrors. I might as well play something that's just solid into a bunch of stuff.
100% agree.
Next up, the second wave deck in the meta, Move Wave. I know you have a preference for this list. I will say one interesting thing that I've seen is a hybrid between these lists, or I guess I should say like quasi-hybrid, which is basically just running Silk and Jeff in high Evo wave. I saw that. I saw someone in the high end of Infinite playing that, and I was like, oh, that's kind of cute. I think that's actually like a very nice like sort of adaptation for the high Evo deck to make, taking a little bit out of Move Wave's playbook. What do you think about Move Wave right now, and do you think the Alioth inclusion makes this deck a little bit more interesting compared to the high Evo one?
Yeah, so I have a special place for Silk in my heart because like I innovated that very like 3 weeks ago version, right? But like now it's gravitating towards a wave like version of the deck, and for good reason as well, because like this deck at the core still just puts out a lot of early stats, right? A lot of 2/5s, 3/5s. Your Kraven is huge. Your Angela is gonna be big. It's like basically the Loki deck without the RNG parts and the early stats, and then you play wave.
Or the free stuff.
Or the free stuff, yeah. So you play a lot
Yeah.
of cheap early stuff into a wave. So a wave fits very, very nicely into this shell, especially now that with Alioth as well, because you are very often gonna be on initiative going into your final turns. So you can sort of isolate the board to a position whereby you know roughly where they're gonna play their last card, and then you Alioth there. So like it kind of just works. It's a very simple. It's definitely not as simple as High Evo because a lot more movement stuff going around. But like in general, it's about the same style, right? Stats into wave into Alioth / Doom. I think this deck personally might be a bit better than the Evo one because you have a bit more flexibility in like how you want to play your cards, shift your cards. And then Silk movement also catches a lot of opponents off guard. And Kraven sometimes gets absurdly big, and Shang-Chi is a little bit absent in the meta right now as well. So I think this deck is actually quite well positioned versus a bit less experienced Loki players. And in general, I think it's also a very solid deck to climb. If you want to like play a not super difficult deck, but also requires a little bit more thinking.
Next up, classic Apocalypse discard is just like, it's kind of always around at this point. And it's like, one of the weird things about this deck is it's consistently gotten better, but it feels like other stuff has consistently gotten better in such a way that if you took the current discard deck 2 months ago, it'd probably be like close to tier 1. But now it's in almost the exact same spot that it was 2 months ago, despite the buff to Blade, which is really good, despite the buff to Lady Sif, which is obviously solid, and despite the addition of Dakin, it's still like, it's a good deck. I just don't think it's a great deck, but it's definitely like, it fills the same role as the Evo stuff, where it's like, look, if you get your stuff, you're going to be able to, at worst, push games against basically everyone to a 50-50. And that's a pretty powerful thing to do.
I think this deck is in a very interesting spot for me for a few reasons. Firstly, this deck is one of those decks that if you draw your stuff, like you say, right, this is one of the most if you draw your stuff, you can never lose kind of decks ever. Like even more so than Evo, even more so than like Shuri to a certain extent. Because there's no interactive. You can't interact with this. Dracula cannot be countered.
Nope.
Swamps, like they cost 0, you just plop them everywhere, and then the Chavez, and then you discard Apocalypse with Dracula and stuff like that. And like the biggest thing this deck got in the last few months that really mattered was Modok, because like every other little addition to the archetype has helped it a bit, but Modok was the one that actually pushed it over the edge to be like the powerhouse that it is, like if you get all the right stuff. But the funny thing is that I don't actually see this deck much in Conquest, because I don't think this is actually a Conquest deck. Like I think you see this more than me because you play a lot of ladder. This is definitely like one of those ladder decks whereby if they just draw the stuff, they snap you, you don't really know what's going on, you stay and you realize, oh no, I'm dead. Yeah, that kind of thing, because they just have the you can't beat this deck if it draws like the things, right? But like in Conquest, because there's like so many locations and so many like multiple rounds of you seeing the same thing, it's a bit less effective. But yeah, no, this deck in general, I feel like if you want to climb, it's actually very solid. It's also not super difficult to play. It's like average difficulty deck when you don't draw.
It's a little harder than it used to be.
Yeah, when you don't draw the good cards, it's like average.
Well, no, because like there's like blade sequencing stuff, right?
True.
Like it's definitely harder than it used to be, because
if you draw the good cards, it's a bit smoother and like it's not that difficult.
Yeah. But like there's like actually like a lot of like weird targeted discard stuff, because Blade will now discard whatever it was you most recently discarded if it comes back into your hand. So it's like, all right, do I Lady Sif? Do I do like Colleen Wing to get swarms, or do I do Lady Sif to get an extra Apocalypse proc? There's like some weird sequencing things that go on there. But the Blade is definitely like, that is a really good card in the deck now. Like, I am very into that card in the deck. Especially, you know, even, like, the worst case scenario for it usually is just Blade Dakin, right? That's just a 3/8. Like, it's just pretty solid.
Agreed.
Up next is Shuri. We're going to use this chance to cover both Shuri Kitty and Shuri Sauron, although I will say at the outset, I think Shuri Sauron is a little bit better positioned, just because it gives your Loki opponents worse garbage. Shuri Kitty, you can still get some reasonable stuff, but like Shuri Sauron, they're getting like, you know, a Red Skull against some filled lanes and like an Ebony Maw that they can't play. And like they just get a lot of bad stuff when they Loki you. Not all bad. Like it's still not like, it's not like you're giving them Cerebro cards, but it's a reasonable deck right now, I think. I also think that it's the kind of deck that good players tend to underrate, because they're like, oh, this is so simple, and they don't want to play it. But that's the exact kind of thing that we want to catch, right? Because part of being a good player is looking past your own like personal biases for a deck, which I think is pretty important to do in a case like this, because like Shuri Sauron is like the exact kind of deck that is what I like to call the Sarah effect. For a longest time, good players in this game loved playing Sarah, just got them more options. They were able to express their skill more reasonably. And this is the reverse of that, right? There's not an enormous amount of skill expression in this deck, but there is a very, very large amount of power.
Yes.
And sometimes you just have to look past your desire to feel smart and actually be smart and just play a deck that you can win with.
I agree. Also, I actually think this deck, like Shuri Sauron, Shuri Kitty, like in general, when I was testing the matchups versus Loki and playing from both sides, I realized this is that one deck, like the Shuri deck, that if you don't actually Loki them to steal good stuff early on, it's actually difficult for the Loki deck to beat this deck.
Yeah.
Now with the inclusion of Cosmo in the many Loki decks, it's a bit easier. But like I feel like in general, this is that one matchup. I feel like if I don't actually Loki them to grab like Shuri Red Skulls, Shuri Visions, they actually just blow me out with pure power. So it's actually quite a decently positioned deck into the meta right now. Also it naturally runs armor, so like all these Alioth decks can go like just get wrecked, you know. So I do think Shuri Red Skull, Shuri Sauron is decently well positioned in the game. And I also do think that like it's actually underplayed right now. Like I don't see it much.
Yes.
But I actually think it's very underplayed, because when I just casually play the deck a little bit here and there, I'm like, wait, how is this ever bad? This is still really good right now.
It's a good deck.
Yeah.
It's a legitimately good deck. And I think a lot of people don't like playing it because they don't feel very in control, right? It's a deck where it's very easy to be like, well, I didn't draw Shuri and I lose, right? But it's like, well, you're playing a card game, right?
Yeah.
Like you It's a deck that just feels so bad when it clunks.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people don't understand that, like, Marvel Snap gives you tools to mitigate that,
Yes.
right? Like, oh, well, I didn't draw Sauron and Shuri and they're snapping me. Well, I better leave.
Yes.
And people just don't like doing that, I think.
Yeah. Next up is my favorite archetype in the game. Everyone knows that I love this metal helmet, the Cerebro. I've been told to play this deck on my stream so many times in all shapes and forms, and I absolutely reject the idea. But okay, that's just my personal bias. But Cerebro right now, I believe, has a place in the meta, specifically Cerebro 3. Because with the new buff to Shadow King, Shadow King is just like an insanely good card in general right now. And it fits really nicely into the Cerebro 3 shell because it's also a 2/3. Plus, you can run stuff like Valkyrie, and basically the Loki deck gets complete junk when they Loki you. So this deck is actually very well positioned into the meta right now. There are some very die-hard Cerebro fans that will be very happy that this deck is good right now. But yeah, okay, and what do you think about Cerebro in the current meta?
Okay, so there's two things. One, Cerebro 5 is like a deck I feel like people want to be good, but fundamentally most of the Cerebro 5 builds seem to be wave builds, which puts it in competition with high Evo wave and move wave. And I think it's kind of a distinct third there, where it's like if you want to build your deck in the shape of other decks, if you want to be like a Wave Doom kind of guy, Wave Doom Goliath, right? You got to ask yourself first if there's a better shell for Wave Doom Goliath. And I think at this point, we can reasonably say that, like, probably both Move and Evo are better shells for it. But if you want to be a Wave Doom, if you want to be the third best Wave Doom Goliath deck, I feel like, you know, if you're like a Cerebro head and you just want like the deck to be playable, this is as close as you're going to get. As far as Cerebro 3, I think it is still good into Loki. Very good into Loki, I would say. Like one of the few decks that I think is like, oh man, that's really good into Loki. But it runs into problems with all the wave decks, basically, right?
Yeah.
Like the High Evo specifically is just one of those decks that just like kind of cleans it up because of just being a normal deck that plays on curve, right? You have these weird issues with Red Skull, because normally like a Valkyrie deck is really good into that, but like you have Valk and Shang-Chi, and then they also just like have Red Skull, and then your entire other lanes are terrible. And like you have these, they're just like a bunch of weird cases where Cerebro 3 has a legitimate case to be in the metagame, but I almost feel like it would be a better deck in a specific highly targeted tournament metagame than it would be on ladder, because against anything other than Loki, I just don't feel like it's very good.
Yeah, just want to add one final point to that, which is that I actually like some of the stuff Cerebro 3 is doing into the meta right now. Not so much this whole Cerebro part, because I feel
Really?
a bit. I feel okay. So I feel my issue. People always ask me why I don't like Cerebro. So this is it. My issue with Cerebro is that you have to run cards in a very curated way, right? Because of their power level, and like which means that you're very limited in your deck building. And when I'm limited in my deck building, I feel very suffocated. I don't like that. It's not something that I like to do. But the thing is, Cerebro 3 runs cards that are actually very good into the meta right now. Shadow King, Killmonger, right? Killmonger is really very good right now. Invisible Woman Killmonger for that fact. And also you can still run Shang-Chi. So a lot of the good tech cards are in the Cerebro 3 deck. So I think it is actually decently well positioned. But I feel like you can run all these tech cards in like another deck and it probably will still be good.
Finally, we've got a high Evo deck. We've got a move wave deck. Do we think there's anything to do with Brood Abs, man? I've been running into some Brood Abs near the top of ladder. It's pretty much like one specific guy who's playing it a lot. And since I'm playing a lot of Loki, it has not felt like a super tough matchup, because Brood Abs is very much like, I'm going to be an efficient mid-range deck. And when you're playing an efficient mid-range deck and then Loki's you, they get to be an even more efficient mid-range deck. And so it's just this very, very unpleasant feeling, I would imagine, from the Brood Abs side. I've only played it from the Loki side, and it has felt very pleasant to me, which means it's probably very unpleasant for them. But I do sort of wonder, like, if a bunch of people are playing, like, these sort of other mid-range decks, right? I mean, there probably is a lot of value in just doing what they do, but better. I mean, we've already seen that Brood Abs is favored into, like, move wave type stuff. We know that from last meta. So do you think there's any room for this deck to be around, or is it just too threatened by Loki to really succeed.
So I think about this deck in the sense whereby, like, I always think about decks in like, all right, what's the best deck? What's the best thing this deck can do versus like other decks? So the best thing this deck can do is still the same, right? Forge Brute apps is like 28 stats now instead of 31. Oh, so sad. I'm just kidding. But like, yeah, it's still like 28 stats. It's a lot, right? So I feel like if you actually hit that curve, you actually still beat Loki. But like, you kind of have to hit that curve, right? Because if you don't hit that curve, they're gonna play Loki on you and they're gonna do it to you, right? They're gonna get like 1 energy Forge into 2 energy Brute, that kind of thing. So that's not gonna be very nice. But like, no, I feel this deck.
Hold on.
What?
Even if you do hit that curve, if they have like Collector, Coulson, Loki, you still lose. Because Collector just solos one of those lanes.
Yeah, okay, so no, that's the thing, that's the thing. So now there is the Alioth, which lets you stop the tall guy from going crazy. But of course, that's assuming the tall guy is played on the final turn. But yeah, Collector is a bit...
Yeah, like
bit
Collector
too...
just solos. Like that's actually the problem I feel like in the matchup is just like yeah, no, they're gonna get your cards and do it better, but also you're like brooding for 15, right?
Yeah.
Your brood is 15, your absman is 12, right?
Yeah.
Collector in the absman lane is like, oh man, that's
like 10-ish.
Really bad. That one guy is like bigger than my 3 guys, and it's just really hard to win from there.
Yeah. No.
And that's actually also bad. Like not only do you need to nut draw, their nut draw beats your nut draw.
Yeah. No, I don't deny that this deck is definitely falling out of favor because of Loki, but like I'm just trying to see, like when I tested this deck, I feel like it still manages to put out the points it needs to put out, but it's very weird to say, right? But remember 2 weeks ago we said that Forge Brute apps was very unfair. Now it feels very fair. Like Forge Brute apps is actually a fair thing to do, which is very weird because it's not like what changed? Loki. Basically Loki happened, right? Loki happened, and then the most unfair thing you did like 1.5 weeks ago is no longer unfair. So it's really the Loki effect. But I feel like this deck still has some like diehard fans that will keep playing this deck. And like the Alioth edition, I think one thing to like talk about when I've tested this deck is that it's not about actually playing Alioth. It's just like being able to Iron Lad into Alioth is very disgusting. Like it's like Iron Lad into Doom, right? This is another Iron Lad into Doom scenario.
Right, like I was playing Iron Lad in the Move Wave deck because Iron Ladding into Alioth is so good, right? And this deck has a much more natural Iron Lad fit, right? Like Alioth Iron Lad fits better into this than it does into the other ones, and that's sort of the thing that makes my ears prick up about this archetype, because like that's actually like an interesting angle, naturally fitting that in instead of forcing it in. This deck is actually a deck that wants to play Iron Lad on 4 a lot of the time, and so that's a very compelling thing for me, I feel like. But that said, I think in addition to the Loki thing, there's like this incredibly awkward spot you find yourself in against Galactus if you just brood into abs, right? Because they can just Galactus the brood lane, and you're just like, oh my god, why did I do any of this, right? Like if you don't forge the brood lane and they wave, you're crying. Because it's not just Galactus there, it's like Hobgoblin, right? Like there's just so much that ruins your life from that specific spot that you're just like, oh man, this is so awkward. And like we talked about, the first 2 decks in here were Loki and Galactus, and I don't know how I feel about the Galactus matchup, but there's definitely some feels bad in there. And I do know how I feel about the Loki matchup, and it's not good. And so those are the main things pushing against this list right now.
Yeah. Just one final thing to add, based on what you said. I feel like this deck now, like in the past, it was a bit more forgiving to just play out a Brood without Forge, right? But I think based on the way the meta is shaping popular decks and like stuff like that, I feel like this deck, if you don't play Forge on 2, I don't think you can actually feel safe playing a Brood or a Sinister on 3, just because it's too weak and it takes up board space, right? Like you said. I feel like if you play Forge on 2 and you don't have Brood or Sinister, you kind of have to wait to top deck Iron Lad on 4 and play it like after the Forge so you can get a swing. If not, I don't actually think you can play anything on turn 3 because you just like die, right? You have to go Forge into high roll or Forge into, or just like play Iron Lad and hope you high roll into like 3 other Broods, that kind of thing. You can't just play a fair game by playing Brood and hoping it's fine in the current meta.
It's so messed up. Think about how far we've come, right? Yeah. Like three weeks ago, this is the most broken, unfair thing you could possibly be doing. Yep. And now we're like, it just doesn't do enough. It's not. Oh my god.
That was an interesting game.
I saw a tweet today that was like, It's crazy how Marvel Snap went from the best meta of all time to the worst meta of all time. And I got to thinking about like different types of players, because for a certain type of player, that's definitely going to be like the kind of thing they think is true, because it went from this very fair mid-range, lots of viable decks meta that was shifting every week to like, oh my god, it's Loki and Galactus everywhere, which are very binary decks, right? And I sort of, I do have some sympathy for that, because I was a big fan of that previous meta, but I like, this is definitely, it's definitely different in a way that I don't know if we've ever experienced. And I don't know how much of that sort of sentiment is due to Loki and how much is due to Galactus, but I'm interested in finding out.
Yeah, all I have to say is that like I do enjoy this meta, and like I'm down to experience more of this kind of metas. It's just that I feel like if it's gonna be this way going forward, whether it's like Marvel Snap power creep or like just cards in general being like busted, I feel like if it's gonna be this way going forward, people just have to adapt to like knowing that the game is not gonna be as simple as it used to be. I mean, like that's just natural progression of card games, right? You start with the basics, and a year or two later, you get all the busted crazy stuff, and then the game just becomes generally more busted and crazy, and people just assume that's the new normal.
Yeah, we've left our Chillwind Yeti era.
Yes. Oh my god, I was about to
We are
say.
no longer.
No more Innovate Yeti, Wild Growth Yeti. Yeah, no
Yes,
more. No more.
we're done. There's no more Innervate Yeti.